started. Dominique, do you want to just tell us about this diagram?
Yeah, no worries. I haven't actually seen this diagram before, but it seems to be explaining the VQ ratios of the lung. So I'll start with the diagram in the middle, because that's diagram A. So this is showing an alveolus with a blood vessel. It's a diagram of that. And you can see that, I guess I'm not sure if it's the partial alveolar pressure of oxygen, which is 100. The partial alveolar pressure of CO2 is 40.
Yes.
And you've got the capillary O2 of 40 and the CO2 of 45, which is showing a normal VQ ratio.
Yes, sounds good.
Yep. So diagram B shows a decreased VQ ratio. So there's decreased ventilation, which is schematically shown or diagrammatically shown by the black plug on the alveolus.
Yeah.
And you can notice that there's a decreased partial alveolar pressure of O2, which is 40, and the CO2 is 45. So minimally increased CO2, but quite a significant decrease in O2. And then in diagram C, you've got an increased CQ ratio. So there's decreased perfusion shown by the black plug there. And you've got a increase in your alveolar oxygen. So it's 150, and your CO2 is 0 because you're unable to diffuse any CO2 from the capillary over into the alveolus.
Okay. Now, that's great, Dominique. So first thing is you just explained, a diagram that was, I guess, kind of familiar, but probably you haven't seen the exact diagram. And you just said true statements about it, and all the data is there. So the next step, what do you notice about the numbers? Just another way to think about this, as you decrease your VQ ratios, what are the numbers very like representing? Sorry, that's the wrong question. These numbers here in B, what are they close to, or exactly the same as?
So the numbers are the same as, I guess, they'd be the same as the capillary, the partial pressures in the capillary. Yeah,
and another way of saying that is the mixed venous blood. I don't say partial pressure in the capillary because partial pressure in the capillary could be before or after. So.
Oh, true. Yeah.
So another way of saying that is, diagram B shows, decreasing VQ, shows, complete shunt, and as you decrease VQ ratios, the partial pressure in the alveolus tends towards mixed venous blood. How about C? What do you notice about
that? So in C, it would be more similar. Well, it's the same as the inspired flow. So, sorry, I'm just trying to think about this. It's like, I want to say FiO2, but it's not the FiO2 because it's a different unit. But basically, the partial pressures will be the same as the inspired gas flow.
Inspired what? Sorry, inspired.
Inspired gas.
Yeah, exactly. So as you increase VQ ratios, the alveolar PO2 and PCO2 will tend towards the whatever the ratios are in normal air. So inspired air. That's right. Give me some examples, Dominique, of dead space and shunt.
So examples of
shunt first.
Shunt, okay. So examples of shunt would be West Zone 4. So decreased ventilation in those zones due to the presence of gravity, or atelectasis, where there's no ventilation, but there may still be perfusion. example of dead space would be pulmonary embolism.
What does West Zone 1 represent in terms of?
So West Zone 1 has an increased VQ, so there's increased ventilation and decreased perfusion.
Yeah. Actually, what other situation? PE is pretty uncommon, but what's maybe another common situation where you might get dead space?
Sorry, nothing's coming to mind apart from pathological kind of things.
Essentially, if you have a reasonable increase in your alveolar air pressures, then there's a chance that could increase your VQ that far above your pressure, so that could collapse your pulmonary capillaries, causing dead space, but also hypotension.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, kind of the common things that cause dead space, aside from a pulmonary embolism, which is the obvious. When you think about a plug in a vessel, you think of pulmonary embolism, but it could just be a decreased flow because of hypotension or hypovolemia as well. That's great, Dominic. Good. And so, obviously this graph is just showing all the different VQ ratios that could exist. There's something interesting about this graph as well. It's saying that all the lung units can only have VQ ratios that only exist on this continual line. There can't be VQ ratios on either side of it. So I thought that was an interesting property of this graph, which is straight from West as well. Okay, I think someone already explained this, but Alex, you're next there. Do you want to just talk about this briefly?
Okay, so looking at this graph, on the x-axis, we've got the number of ribs, so essentially from top to bottom, running from right to left. And on the y-axis, we've got essentially I guess it's the volume of lung that is perfused or ventilated. And essentially, this is showing the change in VQ based on the anatomical difference between the top and bottom of the lung. So as you go towards the top of the lung, you get a decrease in blood flow and a decrease in ventilation, but the actual ratio itself ventilation VQ ratio is higher at the top of the lung than it is at the bottom of the lung. I guess that's kind of what it says.
Yeah, it sounds good. So even though both decrease in their, I guess, flow or the amount of perfusion ventilation, the ventilation perfusion ratios increase dramatically. That's good. So next one here. So how does the alveolus at the apex differ from the base under these parameters? Compliance, ventilation, flow, or perfusion, sorry. The gases. So gases that we can talk about now are PO2 levels, PCO2, pH, respiratory exchange ratio, and intrapleural pressure. Annie, I'm going to pick on you.
Okay. I don't think I've got the right numbers, but
That's
so
right.
I wrote the alveolus at the base, so increased in compliance.
Yes.
And so I don't know the exact number.
No, that's right. How about the relative size of the alveolus at the base?
Oh, it's smaller than the apex.
And I've got to say, I don't think people would really care if you didn't have the number exactly right, but if you know the rough direction, the rough amount, if it's less or more, I think that's the first step towards a reasonable answer. Because
I think the average alveolus is 0.2 to 0.3 microns, but I don't know.
In West, they don't have the numbers for that, so that's right. How about ventilation?
Ventilation, so there's actually increased ventilation compared to the apex and increased blood flow, but overall the VQ ratio is lower because the increase in blood flow exceeds the increase in ventilation, I think.
Sounds good. How about PO2 values, apex?
So I know that I think at the apex is something like 110.
Yeah, that's close. 132 for PO2.
132. And then so I'm guessing at the base is something I don't know, like 90.
Yeah, it's 89. Nice one. How
Okay.
about PCO2?
So PCO2 is lower at the apex. I'm
Yeah.
thinking something like 30 to 32.
Yeah, 28 at the apex. So
And
right.
at the base, I just wrote 45. I just wrote something.
Yeah, it's around 42 according to West. So again, good. Like your gut feelings about these seem accurate. How about pH?
The pH would be high, more sort of alkalemic at the apex, and then more acidotic at the base.
So 7.5 and 7.3.
Okay, yeah.
Respiratory exchange ratio.
So again, I think it'll be lower at the apex and higher at the base, but
It's actually higher at the apex too. Versus,
okay.
I didn't really worry about that one too much for this exam anyway. How the intrapleural pressure?
The intrapleural pressure is more positive towards the base, and I don't know. So it'd be like, I was guessing, if it was -5 on average, maybe something like -5 at the top, and I don't know.
Actually, keep going with that. If it was -5 on average, that means
So -8 at the top.
it was -10 according to West, and at the bottom.
I'd say negative. I don't know, a -4, negative.
Go lower. Go -2.5.
Okay, all right.
I feel like that value is important, just because we seem to talk about intrapleural pressure differences and.
Yeah, it has the compliance curve. I think you have to put some units down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's straight from that kind of compliance curve, knowing that number. Okay, so assuming you know at the apex, what is the pressure, the partial pressure of nitrogen, the PN2?
The PN2.
Yeah.
So it'll be, I'm just gonna get my calculator out. So it'll be 713 subtract the 990. Is it 90?
Yeah, I've got some values up there.
Yeah, so and take away the CO2, 32. So it'll be 591.
Sorry. Just have a look at those numbers again.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So it'd be 713 subtract 132 subtract 28. So it'd be 553.
Perfect. Exactly. And what's that? What is it at the base?
So at the base it'll be again. So take away the vapor pressure. So 713 subtract 89 subtract 42 would be 582.
Beautiful. So I've asked you this question because I feel like it's the very first. If this was an example viva or a part of a viva, you get something that gets you to kind of descriptively talk about the alveolus from the apex to base. That's a pretty straightforward thing. Maybe you go a bit further and you're able to pull out all the different ways. So I would expect that people would be able to talk about things that come to mind. Things that come to mind are things like compliance and ventilation, perfusion, and a few of the gases, maybe the pressures, and then maybe get those numbers approximately right. And then the next type of question is something that takes that knowledge and just extends it a little bit further. So Annie, that was really good that you came up with that. So how did you get that answer? Just explain to everyone.
The partial pressure of nitrogen.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So just work from, I guess, first principle that the alveolar gas is made up of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and nitrogen.
Yep.
And the atmospheric pressure you have to, and also water vapor pressure, which is the same, 47. So assuming you're at 1 atmospheric pressure, then that's 760. You take away 47, and then that'll be 713. And then you just subtract the partial pressure for oxygen and carbon dioxide from the apex and then from the base, and you get the partial pressure of nitrogen.
Yeah, great.
And yeah, so because the partial pressures are additive.
Which law is that?
Oh, is it? It's not Henry's law. I don't know. Sorry.
I actually can't remember. Does anyone know which law that is? Talks about the the pressure of a
Dalton?
Dalton's law. Okay, so the pressure within a system is the combination of the partial pressures of each of the gases that exist in that system. So take the full pressure, or add the pressure of nitrogen, partial pressure of CO2, oxygen, and in this case, because it's inside the alveolus, saturated vapor pressure of humidified gas, and that will total 760. So it's great that you were able to extend that. Good work. Good. Why does the pH change in this, Annie?
Because I think the CO2 is different.
Yeah, exactly. It pretty much reflects the PCO2, so that is correct. And so this is that graph west that kind of all ratios and amounts. It goes into some other values, talking about content as well, and then mils in and out for O2 and CO2. Alex, I might ask you this question. So why is there minimal oxygen uptake at the apex?
Is it because there is maximal distension of the alveoli? So you've got poor perfusion at the apex of the lung, therefore they can't actually, the oxygen can't actually diffuse as well as it does at the base?
So there's a few things. I feel like your overall answer is correct, but I'm not sure the reasons are right. So why is there less perfusion up at the apex?
Because of the, is it because of the maximal distension? I'm not actually sure if I've got the right message here.
Pretty much it's just gravity, hydrostatic pressure, there's more perfusion at the base than the apex.
Oh, right, yep, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all good. So even though the ventilation and PO2 is really high at the top, so PO2 is really at the top, there just isn't that much blood flow to get the maximal amount of oxygen. That's good. So what happens with exercise? I'm just reading the answer there. Increased oxygen uptake. Why does that happen? Why do you get increased oxygen uptake at the apex with exercise?
Because you're going to get increased blood flow to, I guess, all of your organs, but predominantly your lungs as well. So you're going to have increased perfusion to all of the areas of your lungs. So I presume that the West Zone 1 would become somewhat more like a West Zone 2, but not quite. And so then you're going to get more oxygen diffusing across.
Yeah, that's pretty much right. And then you might get asked, what is the term for that? Oxygen, when exercise increase, you get the increased blood flow that you correctly said. So you get far more cardiac output. Your pressures will increase in your vessels. Something then happens to vessels in the lungs. 2 words that they might ask you about.
I'm literally drawing a blank right now.
To
be fair, I'm like not ready.
You might hear the terms recruitment and distension. So that would happen in context. So the ultimate implication of this VQ inequality, it's a bit of a broad.
It's going to improve basically, or your perfusion will improve, so you'll get a better VQ matching.
Yep, and that is true in that exercise situation. And then this question's a bit vague, but so when they talk about this in West, what's the ultimate implication of this VQ inequality when there isn't exercise happening or recruitment and distension, is that you can never get to that optimal VQ ratio because of this VQ inequality. Because of that spread of VQ numbers, you'll never get you'll never be able to get as high an oxygen level, a PO2 level in the blood, and most efficient elimination of CO2, no matter what you do, because you've got this vast spread of VQ ratios. Why is there a depression in arterial PO2 by VQ mismatch? Why do you reckon that is?
Okay, so I'm not really sure what that means, like in terms of between the top and the bottom. Is that what you mean?
Oh, let's say because you have this VQ mismatch throughout the lung, once the blood flows outside of the lung into your arterial system.
Why is there a change in arterial PO2 because of the VQ mismatching? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I guess that's the mixing of your poorly perfused alveoli not getting any oxygen through, and then your well perfused oxygen or alveoli delivering oxygen, and then that all mixing at the end into your pulmonary veins.
And why doesn't that all balance out? Like say the top has lots of oxygenation, the bottom has poor oxygenation. Why doesn't it all balance out to this kind of median level?
Was that because of the gravity? Like, I'm not.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah. So because of gravity,
you can't really but you can't perfuse the top of the lung any better, well, as well as you can at the bottom of the lung, and it is what it is. I mean, obviously it adjusts for, like, I'm not really sure actually.
No, that's right. I mean, you're on the right track in the sense that because of gravity, your lower VQ segments have a lot of blood. So because of gravity, there is far more perfusion in the bottom part of the lung. But because there's more volume going through the bottom, through the base of the lungs with poor VQ segments, they just cannot make up for the immense, the immense amount of blood at the base cannot make up for the low perfusion at the apex with good oxygen levels can't make up for all of that poor VQ blood at the base. When we look at the VQ ratios, you can see all these numbers with a pretty decent spread. So just looking at this, there's a logarithmic graph showing VQ on the x-axis and ventilation of blood flow on the y-axis. You can see that these lung segments, they're really tightly aligned. I mean, considering it is a logarithmic graph, maybe not that tightly aligned. So the next question I could get you guys to think about is, what does a sick lung look like? Okay, so this goes on to show that this is what the distribution of VQ ratios in a patient with chronic bronchitis and emphysema would look like. Andrew, can you describe what's going on here? Andrew Tellman.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
So, yeah, good question, because that confused me. I was expecting to see in a situation where you've got bronchitis, so a ventilation issue, that there would be areas of lungs that are, either gas trapped or poorly ventilated, but I wasn't expecting to see such a significant change in blood flow. I thought it would be a ventilation issue. So I'm a bit confused. And I also can't describe the two peaks, which are not what I was expecting. So I suppose to some extent, to compare it just to if I was throwing this in a Viva and I had no idea where I was going, I'd just try and describe what I see.
Yep, go for it.
So there, I can't remember what the units were on the last graph, but if I had point of comparison, but there's been a reduction in the peak in blood flow, and it's also been shifted to the left slightly. So, we had liters per minute of almost 1.5 now, and that's both peaks of both graphs have reduced significantly by almost half, but there's been a greater reduction in blood flow than there has been.
What do you make? How do you describe those two peaks? Just say what you're saying again.
So like previously, it's in liters per minute, so the y-axis.
Yep.
Been a significant reduction in both, in the vicinity from 1.5 liters per minute to now almost a third of that.
Yeah. And why are there two peaks there? What do you make of that?
For the blood flow? Yeah. I don't know. That's what I'm not sure about.
I think
maybe gas trapping.
I think what's not described on this graph is that it's showing that there's it's almost like it's talking about the numbers of lung units in total. I could be wrong about this, but it's not obviously on this graph. But to me, it's showing that there's a whole bunch of lung units with low VQ ratios.
Okay, so like in a situation where you've got gas trapping, and you're
exactly
ventilating an area of lung. So there's a whole bunch of lung that has blood flow that is demonstrated by the smaller peak, but no ventilation.
Yeah, exactly. So this can still be a ventilation problem. It's just saying that that you've got your normal lung sitting here, and there's quite a few of them. There is less. There's more of a spread of badness here with lots of lung units, being spread across this high to low VQ ratios. But then there's this whole bunch of lung that's if you think of bronchitis or affecting very specific parts of the lung, you can imagine that there's just going to be a whole bunch of the lung with really poor VQ segments. That's what I make of this graph. It's almost quantitative. I
sort of get what you mean now. It's not matching the two together. It's describing what each's unit's VQ ratio is.
That's right. So that's that. So if you were to summarize two critical differences between this graph and the first graph, what do you reckon those would be? This graph and this graph. What are the two critical differences?
So the major one is, as we talked about, there's lung units with very poor VQ match, demonstrated by the first peak.
That's the segment here.
And then there's a reduction in total amplitude of the units that do have reasonable. So there's both a reduction in ventilation and perfusion of the ones with a ratio of 1.
Great, and I'd describe that decreased amplitude as due to a spread. So there's, it's less tightly, defined around 1. Like there's more of a spread of, poor and, high VQ and low VQ ratio. So there isn't this beautiful uniformity like normal lung. That's to me, that's why there's such a decrease in amplitude, because there's just more, the same blood flows occurring, but just across a whole, large bunch of VQ ratios.
Yeah.
So here's I think this is straight from Miller's, and it talks about, a few different pathologies, and it actually contradicts the previous diagram to one extent. So A is normal lung, and then here we go. So if you look at these graphs, so asthma is graph B, COPD is graph C, and pneumonia is graph D. So sticking with you, Andrew, do you want to just describe what you see there?
Yeah. So A, as we said, is a normal lung with a relatively matched ventilation perfusion. I suppose I'll just quickly describe B, because that's probably most similar to what the bronchitis picture was earlier. So in that, we've got areas, lung segments that are perfused but not ventilated, demonstrated by that early peak.
Yeah.
The COPD lungs is kind of a little bit of the opposite that. You've got areas of lung that are ventilated but not perfused, demonstrated by a late peak. Well, not a late peak, but there's areas where there's a high perfusion. There's a VQ mismatch with perfusion, with ventilation but not perfusion. And then the pneumonia lung. So while you have, I suppose, relative VQ matching, there's areas of lung that are ventilated more than perfused. I don't really know how to describe I would do the other way around there.
Good. No, that's all right. So what I'll go straight to the just take a screenshot of this in case I haven't put it in the notes, or take a photo or screen capture of this. But you're essentially right. So B, broader distribution of VQ so there's a broader distribution that we talked about, with some regions being ventilated well in excess of perfusion, and another mode of low VQ centered around the ratio of 0.1. So this mode can be explained by collateral ventilation, maintaining gas exchange in alveoli behind occluded airways. There's no shunt seen in asthma. In COPD, the pattern is similar to asthma, with an additional high VQ mode that adds to dead space, such as ventilation. Shunt is not present, and the pattern of VQ distribution not associated with significant hypoxemia. In lobar pneumonia, the major finding is pure shunt, consolidated, perfused, and poorly ventilated lobe. So there is only minor widening of the VQ distribution. Obviously, there's things that they say there that don't exactly make sense to me, saying that there's no shunt, but I think it's talking about this specific example. So you can imagine that, if someone had severe asthma or severe bronchitis or, sputum plugging or something, that you would have shunt in that particular circumstance. But in these experimental asthmatics and those with COPD, they're saying that it doesn't show shunt in this particular example.
Sorry, Lahiru, can you just go back to the graph for a second?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
These graphs, this just so I can look this up later, this is from Miller's?
Yeah, actually, here it is. Miller's graphs in figures 19-26.
Lahiru, just a quick point.
Kieran, yeah.
Perhaps I'm admin suggesting that Miller's might be wrong, but it seems in graph D, in their synopsis, they were saying that because of the pneumonia, there's less ventilation and more perfusion, but it seems as though maybe they've swapped them on the graph. It doesn't quite make sense to me that they're indicating there's increased ventilatory flow and less perfusion.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So in lobar pneumonia, the major finding is pure shunt, consolidated, perfused, and poorly ventilated lobe. There's only minor widening of the VQ distribution.
Is that saying, because if you've got an alveoli full of pus, it's effectively a non-ventilated, like it's got, there's no match, it's just completely gone. Is that, no, don't worry about that, I'm confused.
I guess I'm just confused by it indicates the yellow line of increased ventilation in litres per minute, but it almost implies the opposite.
Can you just say that again?
So on graph D, the alveolar ventilation in litres per minute for around just above a VQ of 1 is much more increased, but it was almost implying that there should be much less ventilated lung parenchyma.
Yeah, I'm really not sure. I would imagine a graph with lobar pneumonia should show far more low VQ segments. That would be my impression. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly why that is. They do show the Q, the shunt fraction, the QS to QT ratio, showing an obvious increase in shunt. Yeah, look, maybe if someone could go to Miller's and just see if they can make more of an interpretation of that, that'd be great, and they can just email the group.
Sorry, I don't mean to dwell on that. I was just a bit confused myself.
Yeah.
I don't really like Miller's definition of shunt. It's quite confusing, the difference between dead space and shunt.
Yeah, that's right. What do we? I think we all know what dead space and what shunt is. We can imagine situations with that, so that won't be a problem. I feel like maybe this is useful to see what the experimental data looks like for for different segments. And this is just a hypothetical thing that you might be asked to talk about or describe in a viva, but at least you can talk about it intelligently using these first principles. So maybe that's the biggest take-home message at the end of this. But if someone does feel like delving into this, that'll also be fine. Okay, so the next part of the syllabus discuss the carriage of oxygen in blood, oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, oxygen stores in the blood, and their clinical significance and implications. Andrew, I might start quizzing you a little bit, if that's all right. How is oxygen carried in the blood?
So it is mostly bound to HB.
Yep.
And some of it is chemically dissolved in blood as well.
Beautiful. Before we get into that, so after you've drawn that curve, what are the standards? Like what are the standards around that curve, looking this way and shape and how it is?
Okay, so we're drawing in the vertical axis the oxygen saturation.
Yep. What are the standards? In terms of why is the P50 point what it is?
Because of the sigmoid shape of the oxygen dissociation curve. So you're talking about P50, which translates to about 26.6 millimeter of mercury. Why is it the way it is because of the sigmoid shape of the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve.
I'll ask you a bit more directly, and maybe standard is not the right word, but what is the standard pH, the standard CO2, and the temperature that gives you the frame of where this curve's going to be?
Ooh, 7.4 physiological pH. What was the other one? CO2.
Yeah, so this graph is, the assumptions that of this graph looking the way we learn it is pH, CO2, and temperature, and a P50 point as well.
I know what you mean. Temperature is 37.
Yep.
pH of 7.4.
And PCO2?
40.
Yeah, exactly. So, as I'm drawing this graph in the exam, I'm saying look, on this axis I've got this, on this axis I've got this, and this is with the, with the standards of the PCO2 being 40, pH 7.4, temperature 37 degrees, and the P50 of 26.6. You can say it all to make your answer sound sharper. So that's good. What shifts the curve to the right?
So it can be caused by 4 things: temperature, an increase in acid, H+, concentration H+, the PCO2, and the 2,3-DPG.
Sounds good. What does 2,3-DPG stand for?
Okay, it's I can't remember, 2,3-D something. I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
That's right. Don't worry about it.
I always call it DPG. I know there's a full term for it.
How do you get a left shift of the curve?
So you have got a reverse of that right shifting. So you have got a decrease CO2, decrease in temperature, a decrease in PCO2, and a decrease in the 2,3-DPG level.
Is that it?
And I think there's one more.
You got another one there already, so don't forget the pH as well. And there's one more aside from that. It's kind of toxicity. This toxicity prevents the offloading.
Oh, is this the carboxy?
What gas would you really not want to inhale?
CO.
Yeah, carbon monoxide.
Yeah.
The left shift of that curve as well.
Okay.
Are you familiar with calculating content, Andrew? The content of oxygen. And what does
is this using the oxygen flux equation? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, oxygen flux equation. The flux adds something to the content. So I wouldn't call this the oxygen content equation. The oxygen content is different to the oxygen flux equation.
Oh, sorry.
One specific parameter. That's right. Give me the content equation if you're happy to.
Sorry, now I'm a bit confused. Or the one that I know was the one that I think Kieran mentioned last week, which was the cardiac output times constant hemoglobin times oxygen saturation.
Yeah, let's. Are you able to write on this by any chance? Actually, you can tell me what you're saying. I'm just going to write it down.
Okay. So the way I look at it was that the oxygen content equation has got 2 parts.
Yes.
It's got the part that is dissolved, which is the small part. And then there's the chemical part, which is bound to hemoglobin. So the first part of the equation is cardiac output times hemoglobin. So CO times HB times oxygen saturation.
Yeah. And something else you got to times it by.
Huffner's number.
Yep, which is?
Huffner's number about 1.34.
Oh, this is terrible writing, sorry.
That's,
You've got hemoglobin, time constant, times saturations. That's your bound content.
Yep. And then you got a dissolved one, which is PaO2 of the arterial blood times 0.003 depending on the units that we are talking about.
Yep, so beautiful. So 0.003.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I'm going to tell you guys now to just use one set of units. It'll just make it so much simpler, and that's what we're going to kind of talk about now. So, is everyone happy that this is the content bound and this is the dissolved? You mentioned the word chemical to as a synonym for bound, but I wouldn't use that, Andrew. I'd just go dissolved and bound to hemoglobin parts. Good. So,
Leo, can I ask you one question? So you said there was a difference between the oxygen content equation and the oxygen flux. Is it because one is adjusted with cardiac output and the other one's not?
Exactly. That is exactly right. So when I talk about content and you say cardiac output times HB,
okay.
That's incorrect, right? Because we're just talking about content. When we talk about flux, the way I think of it, I figure they use the word flux because it's talking about a movement. movement into and out of cells. So give me some values for this, just some numbers just to plug in here for example's sake.
Okay, so let's say HB of 15.
Yep, what are the units?
It would be the gram per deciliter for hemoglobin.
Beautiful, and that's really important, right? Grams per deciliter. When else in life do you ever use deciliters? Like never, right? So that's a really important thing where when people are asked to reproduce this equation, they can get messed up with this. So 15 grams per deciliter times 1.3
times, let's say 99%, so it's expressed as a fraction, 0.99.
Let's just go 100, makes it easier.
Okay, yep, we can do 100, which is 1.
Yeah, which is 1.
Yep. Plus, so if we are saturating 100%, that's slightly higher than 100, but let's call it 100 for PO2.
Sounds good.
Times the 0.003.
Beautiful. And what final result do you get here?
Approximately 1,000 mils of oxygen per minute.
Are you sure?
Oh, wait.
Just, I'm gonna get you to just use a calculator multiply.
sorry. That's with cutting output. It's only 20.4.
Yeah, right. So there's roughly 20 mils attached in the, bound to hemoglobin, and the 0.3 mils. So really, the dissolved portion is far less. I'm just approximating things here. Okay, so that's literally the content equation using our very specific numbers here. So I haven't had time to write all the units and everything down. If I then want to turn that into the oxygen flux equation, what do I multiply this by?
So you multiply by the cardiac output, but that has to be adjusted too because we're using deciliter.
Right, so that's exactly right. So everyone hear that? So because we've used deciliters here, the oxygen flux equation cardiac output is what's your normal cardiac output, Andrew?
5 liters per minute.
Beautiful. So we got to change 5 liters per minute into something like deciliters per minute. So can you tell me how many deciliters per minute is the cardiac output?
50.
Beautiful. So then the number for your oxygen flux equation, what numbers am I multiplying here for the oxygen?
So it's 20.4 times 50 gives us 1020 mils of oxygen per minute.
Great. I don't care about the little, small digits. It's roughly 1,000. And that's where you get your normal kind of oxygen delivery of 1,000 mils per minute.
Yep, and we need 250 mils per minute.
Exactly. So your basal metabolic rate is roughly 250 mils per minute. Any questions about that before we move on?
Sorry, just quickly, the unit for oxygen content?
It's mils per deciliter, it'd be.
Mils per deciliter, great, thanks.
What governs the dissolved portion? What law governs the dissolved portion, Andrew?
Are you talking about the Haldane effect, that kind of stuff?
No, so Haldane is completely just...
Okay, completely different, sorry.
Yeah.
You mentioned law.
Yeah, there's a law that governs the amount of dissolved gas in a solution.
Oh, Boyle's law?
No. Boyle's law is due to pressure and volumes.
I'm getting
so many gas laws. Okay, so here's everyone's mission. There's Charles, there's Boyle's, there's Avogadro's law, there's Dalton's, there's Henry's. I think it's a good time to write down all your laws and just find some kind of mnemonic, some kind of memory device to remember those laws, because that is one of those things that seems to get asked a lot in the Viva. and makes you sound smart if you can, you know, quote that in your SAQ as well, I'm sure. You know, you just imagine that's a half a point for something, right? Anyway, so Henry's law governs the, you know, the dissolved amount of any gas in any liquid, really.
Okay. I'll look it up.
The amount of gas dissolved is proportional to the partial pressure of that gas.
Cool.
Okay, I'm just going to clear this drawing. And do that. So yeah, 1.34 HPs grams per deciliter. What law governs that? And that's, yeah, that's all the information there. Okay, so.
Sorry, Lahiru, one question. I mean, that's the standard curve that you just showed there.
Yes.
In Viva, I'm guessing this is an okay graph to reproduce. Would they ask us question like plot oxygen content on the y-axis and PO2 on the x-axis, just to throw us off?
Absolutely, absolutely. And the curve looks pretty much the same with oxygen content as well. Am I right about that, Andrew? Oxygen content will look the same. I think Kerry Brandis shows in his book a similar graph. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty good exercise. You know, using you know, PO2 on the, you know, on the x-axis, just change the y-axis oxygen content to see how the graph changes, and I suspect it'll be pretty much the same.
I think last year they asked the question. There was a short answer for candidates to graph CO2 and oxygen on the same graph, and because CO2 is often a content, it's never a percentage.
Yes.
To do that. It's pretty rough though, because it's the first time I've seen that be asked.
Yeah, that is pretty rough.
And they also said in their examiner report, it doesn't matter if they're on separate graphs, even though they specifically asked for it.
Which I thought, again, like given how often they are very harsh on candidates for not answering the question, to just like be like, oh, if you did it on different graphs, that's okay. I thought that was a bit harsh as well.
Yeah, that, I mean, no surprise, happens all the time. Just yeah, that's just how it is. Yeah. Until you become an examiner and you can change the system. Okay, let's move on to, and we will come to that. So, I mean, I'm a big fan of just, do you know how many people pass that quite tricky question where you have to graph the same CO2 and oxygen on the same graph?
I can tell you in 2 seconds. I'll just quickly get it up. And
the point of that is I expect it will be a pretty low pass rate, and that, you know, that will just get asked again and again. The low pass rate stuff.
28%.
Yeah, good. It'll get asked again. Just and we'll actually go to that graph in the next few slides anyway. So yeah, let's do this now. So I'm going to ask you guys. I want you to draw a diagram of showing the Bohr effect. Whoop, that's it. I want you to tell me, yeah, just draw the diagram in the next couple of minutes, and I'll ask someone the questions of, you know, what is it? Just describe the Bohr effect, and why does it happen? Lisa John, do you want to have a go at this?
Yeah, sure. So,
what would the diagram look like if you were to draw it?
So it would be a right shift of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. So I can't remember exactly what the values would be, but yeah, just a right shift essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Your P50 just shifts. Perfect. What is it? Actually, before we go on, I used to get confused. I used to have a lot of trouble remembering the Bohr versus the Haldane. Is there a way that you remember that? I don't know if other people have this problem, or it's just me.
No, it's definitely not just you. I also like really struggled with that. And I don't know, I think it was just repetition, going over it again, over and over again. So I just remember the Bohr as being relating to oxygen and the Haldane the Haldane referring to CO2.
I mean, the way I remember that was I just, you know, BO, there's an O, you know, pretty prominently in the Bohr effect. And yeah, so Bohr is for oxygen, big O there. And it's really the normal, like we seem to talk about the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve a lot. So the fact that it's just about something I'm very familiar with just helped me remember it. So yeah, Bohr's oxygen, it's just the normal movement of your HP oxygen dissociation curve. But sorry, go on, Lisa. What is the Bohr effect?
So the Bohr effect refers to the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, and that it reduces under certain circumstances, and that being an increase in hydrogen ions or decrease in pH, an increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide.
Okay. So say that again. So what happens to oxygen?
It's the affinity of it for hemoglobin changes, and that's due to a change in the conformational state. So it changes from the relaxed to the tense state.
Okay. And still, I don't have a sense of if it's more or less affinity.
Oh, sorry, the affinity is reduced.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you did say that. Thanks. Sorry. Yeah, good. So the Bohr effect describes the decreased affinity of oxygen for hemoglobin due to change it with increased CO2 or H plus ions. And you just mentioned as well. So what does occur due to? Why does it happen?
So it's the conformational state of the hemoglobin changes. So it goes from a relaxed to the tense state. And I can't remember, it's something to do with the DPG. The DPG, I think, binds to the beta units to cause that conformational change, or as part of that conformational change.
You've got a lot of detail there. I didn't go into that detail, but I'm not saying that that's wrong at all. That all sounds very familiar to me. But yeah, all I said for this was changes in pH affect the numerous electrostatic bonds, affecting that maintain the quaternary structure of HP, and so the stability of the molecule. But your answer sounds very familiar. I'm sure you're right about that.
That's
good.
another way of putting it, though. That's like nice and succinct, saying that's what happens to the bonds.
Yeah.
Can I just ask? Can I confirm that the Bohr effect purely describes the change in affinity of oxygen for hemoglobin in different environments? It's not specific to any particular thing, such as pH, CO2. It there's lots of things that can shift the oxygen hemoglobin curve, and the Bohr the Bohr effect a umbrella term for all of those?
So that's a really good question. So when I looked at this, the definition specifically talked about HbO2 affinity changes due to H plus and CO2. So yeah, I don't have an answer to that, because it seems logical that any of the changes, through 2,3-DPG and temperature would also, cause a shift and would relate to the Bohr effect. But very specifically, the Bohr effect, I've always been told that from what I've read, just describes H plus and CO2. But if someone has a quoted or referenced answer, please share that. That just to say that it encompasses all the different changes.
I don't have a reference, but that was in my reading as well. They only ever referred to H plus or CO2 when they were talking about the Bohr effect.
Andrew, where did you have you seen something somewhere, or it's just a general?
No, it just makes sense. Like when I initially learned it, I sort of learned it as the Bohr effect being how the affinity of HB changes in the presence of different CO2. And I know hydrogen ions relate to CO2, but we're effectively describing the same thing, aren't we? Like it's basically describing why oxygen offloads at the tissues.
Yeah, and so what you're saying is that you're saying logically a very correct thing, but if you can imagine the first experiments that Bohr did, he may have just done that with H plus or CO2. Therefore, that first paper may have just been a H plus and CO2. Therefore, it's really just specifically that. And until it changes in the context of description.
Yeah, no problem. It just came up because just as putting pen to paper as I was trying to define it, I thought, well, if I'm writing CO2 and H plus, why not include the other things? But I see what you mean. Yeah.
If you have a reference answer, though, definitely include it. But I think you'll be very safe to just say H plus and CO2. Let us know if you find something different.
Cool.
So the Bohr's pretty. I think feel like it's relatively easy to explain. I want you guys to take a minute now and explain what's going on in this graph here. Okay, Simon Leckenby, do you want to tell me what's going on here?
Yes. So as a general summary, I would say it talks about the CO2 carriage in blood. Is essentially a summary of the Haldane effect. So describing the figure, it shows that the difference in arterial versus venous arterial blood in terms of CO2 carriage, looking at the dissolved content of CO2, the CO2 that is bound to bicarbonate, carried as bicarbonate, and the CO2 that's bound to hemoglobin is carbamino HB.
Yes.
The Haldane, it shows the Haldane effect in the sense that CO2 is bound to HB and is highly, HB is, has a high affinity for CO2. From the CO3 point of view, it shows that your largest amount of CO2 is actually present in blood as bicarbonate due to the reaction, which I don't have a touch screen, but I would draw this on here. But actually, it's due to carbonic anhydrase in the red cells, and then a smaller proportion of CO2 is actually dissolved.
Yeah, that's good. So that's good, Simon. So why is it, like, we've got here arterial blood, and then we've got venous arterial difference. Why are they representing it like venous arterial difference and not just as venous? Like, what's up with that?
That's a very good question. I think is it relating to the fact that it wants to show the change, so to represent the Haldane effect greater, or? Yeah,
exactly. So if you think about the amount of CO2 in arterial versus venous blood, this amount here, the difference is actually really small. So if you were, like when I conceptualize this, if you were doing the studies on this, you wouldn't really get across the incredible amount that carbamino compounds contribute to the difference. And that's a big deal, right? The carbamino compounds have such a massive impact that it wouldn't really be shown by just showing the venous amount of each of these substances. So that to me is the reason why they have this, showing the difference and the relative proportions that contribute to that difference, rather than the venous stuff itself. Let's keep moving. I'll just go through some questions here. Dissolved law for CO2. What law is that, Simon?
For the Haldane effect.
Oh, sorry, dissolved CO2.
Sorry. The dissolved CO2, which law? So that'll be Henry's law, will it not?
Yeah, exactly. And what's the amount? What's the formula for CO2, dissolved CO2?
I can't actually think off the top of my head.
Yeah, that's all right. I'm going to ask you another question. What's the formula for dissolved oxygen in blood, which we just went through?
So 0.003 times the PaO2.
Exactly, yeah, mils per PO2. And how much more soluble is CO2 than oxygen?
20 times.
Great. So I want you to do the sums now, because the number for oxygen. The dissolved oxygen in blood is 0.003.
Yep.
Of the times of PO2. And if CO2 is, like you correctly said, it's about 20 times more soluble. So if you multiply 0.003 by 20, you get 0.06. And it's one of those things that you will constantly go through the dissolved oxygen, but CO2 dissolved is less of a number that you'll remember, but you can work it out just by knowing that it's 20 times more soluble. So dissolved CO2, Henry's law, it's 0.067. So I want to ask you then, you talked about bicarbonate, and that's a common reaction that you'll go through in so many different parts of it. So you spoke about the importance of carbonic anhydrase, liberated H+ binds to reduce HB. So can you define for me the Haldane effect?
So the Haldane effect, it's to do with the deoxygenated hemoglobin has a higher affinity for carbon dioxide than does oxygenated hemoglobin.
Beautiful, really brief and simple way of saying that. That's great. So describe to me what happens with carbamino compounds then. How does that work?
Just the fact that carbamino CO2 binds to HB and is carried by HB, and I think each hemoglobin molecule can carry 4.
You can, so yeah, reduced CO2 can bind more CO2 as carbohemoglobin than HbO2, which is important. Does it need an enzyme for that to work?
I'm going to say yes, and I've completely forgotten what it is.
No, it doesn't actually. So it's a very fast reaction, and it doesn't require an enzyme. So that's another useful fact. And there's the formula, and just the fact that yeah, reduced HB binds more CO2 than oxygenated hemoglobin.
So carbonic anhydrase doesn't play a role.
Carbonic anhydrase has no role in carbamino compounds. It's a reaction that's rapid without an enzyme. So yeah, the Haldane effect roughly doubles the loading and unloading of CO2. And so you know, if you think about what I was talking about before, you've got your arterial amount. So that's yeah, blood CO2 content on the y-axis. And imagine if you're trying to express, you know, what the venous content looks like. It really, you know, it just doesn't seem to be much at all. It's not something that, you know, you can really show a great difference in. So that venous arterial difference is, if everyone can see my arrows here, it's literally this portion here that you're magnifying and showing that carbamino compounds now contribute a massive amount to that venous arterial difference. Do you guys want to, so have a go at this, draw as best as you can the CO2 dissociation curve, and then I'll ask some questions about it. Tom, were you able to draw that curve? Tom?
Yeah, I'm here. I've drawn it, but I don't have the values.
Oh, that's right. So
if I put my... it looks something like that, but I didn't know any of the values.
No, good one. That's fine. Looking at the graph that I've just put up there, yeah, just talk to me about what you see on this graph.
Sure. So this is a graph of carbon dioxide concentration versus the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. It shows 3 graphs proportional to the percentage of the saturation of the oxygen hemoglobin saturation, and that's because of the Haldane effect. So increasing your hemoglobin oxygen saturate, your oxyhemoglobin saturation decreases your ability of hemoglobin to carry CO2.
Fantastic.
The first graph shows, the topmost line shows what you'd expect in normal arterial blood. The second line, which is, sorry, I take that back. The first line shows what you'd expect in blood, deoxygenated blood. And the second line shows normal venous blood. And the third line shows what you'd expect in arterial blood.
Excellent.
And the line down the bottom demonstrates the dissolved content or concentration, the concentration of CO2 due to the dissolved component, which is small.
That's really great. So you've outlined all the facts that you can see. I want you now, what can you describe about the curve?
It looks like the top of like an exponential build-up curve, but that's not the best way to describe it.
Yeah, look, just simply, it's an important facet of this is that it's more linear.
Yeah.
And that has implications. So, you know, rapidly, you know, increasing ventilation can offload CO2, for example, but it can't really do much for oxygen, you know, because you've got a sigmoidal shaped curve for that. And you mentioned, yep, so there's a Haldane effect. Why is this H plus and carbamino compounds? And so if you were to draw, do you guys want to have a go now?
Can I ask you a quick question just in terms of key points when making that graph? Like when we draw the oxygen hemoglobin graph, we've got like, you know, points we can put on like, you know, SATs 90, mixed venous 75, P50. But when you do this one,
Yeah.
and like 2 points, arterial and venous, which are different graphs,
Yes.
how do you know the gradient? Like how can you actually demonstrate a gradient other than just to draw a relatively linear line and say that's kind of what it is?
Yeah, that's what I'd do. I'd get those individual points right, and I'd draw a relatively linear line because I haven't seen any other points for it.
Yeah, okay. And okay, so you just, yeah, so it's kind of, there's no way of being like, oh, at a partial pressure of this is what the concentration should be other than those 2 points.
Yeah, and that inherently is why it's such a challenging, you know, like you'd think that something with more information would be almost challenging, you got more to remember. But I remember looking at this and thinking, oh, that's why it's really unsatisfying and a bit confusing to draw this, because, you know, we've got a lack of information. So it's almost like that lack of information created, for me at least, a inability to draw it when I first came across this type of problem. But, you know, I guess you know, it's great that you've alerted, you know, you've realized that, because now you go, well, actually, it will be pretty easy to draw this. I just have two values. I've got, you know, 2 values or 4 values, and I can plot that easily onto a content curve now, just based on, you know, just based on the very little we need to know and know about this CO2 dissociation curve. So yeah, I mean, using that, the next question is, can you draw the CO2 on the oxygen curve with content and not saturations on the y-axis? How would I just put this up here?
Yeah.
It's a, so I forgot who was asking that, who mentioned that last very valuable point, that, you know, the fact that you don't have too many points. You've got an arterial curve and a venous curve, and they're different curves, and those are the only 2 points you have. You know, 1 point per curve isn't really a great way of, you know, reproducing curves. But this is, you know, this is straight from West's. If I was to draw this curve, I think there's a really reasonable way of drawing it. I mean, straight from West's as well. So, you know, which is like the prescribed text. So if I was to draw this curve, this is literally the, you know, this is literally what I'd draw and say, you know, and if I was being questioned on it, you know, you could say this is, you know, West diagram, you know, whatever. And
yeah, that was me who asked about it. And then I suppose this does bring up the question, because we've now, as opposed to the last graph, drawn it on the one curve as opposed to
yes.
2. You know what I mean?
Yes. And I'd say, just, you know, if this is what West draws, understanding the problems with this curve, it still gives you the important features of this. Like, I mean, tell me, Andrew. So, I mean, what are the important differences between these curves?
So as we described, the hemoglobin curve is more of a sigmoid shape,
yes.
with a steeper section, I suppose, in lower partial pressures.
Yes.
Whereas the CO2 curve is more linear,
mm-hmm.
and sort of consistent over all partial pressures.
Yep. And how about the gradient of the CO2 versus the oxygen curve?
The gradient is steeper in the CO2 curve. Oh, it's not really, is it? Yeah, but it does look like it in here.
I'd say it's steeper at all values. Like it never gets, even at its least steep part, it never gets to the lower gradients at lower PO2s.
Yeah.
Like it's always steep. What is that absolute difference between the content of arterial and venous arterial and venous CO2, roughly?
I think for arterial CO2, where like the PaCO2 say would be about 45, I think it's about 52 mils per 100 mil, and then for venous, where so I've got them the other way around. In venous, about 45, and it equals about 52 mils, and in arterial, where the PaCO2 is about 40, I think it's about 48.
Yeah. So again, what are the absolute differences in content of CO2 and oxygen between the arterial and venous systems?
Oh, sorry. Okay. So in venous, there'd be about 52 mil of CO2, but in arterial, it'd be about 15 mils. So is that what you're asking?
Yeah, the difference though.
Oh, okay. So 52 minus 15, so about 35, 37.
Ooh, I'm getting different. As in, there's very little difference between 20 and what, 70.
Oh, I thought you were asking. So how much? Oh, yeah. So I suppose between I'm a little bit confused what you're asking. Are you asking in terms of comparing like venous and arterial between the two, or?
Yeah, sorry. What is the difference in oxygen amounts on the oxygen curve? And then what's a separate question, what's the difference of CO2 content on the venous and arterial side? Just
okay, so on the oxygen side, there's a difference of 5 mil. And then on the CO2 side, there's a difference of, I think, about 4 mil. So pretty much the same. Is that?
Look, I've got here different amounts there. So
You're probably right. I haven't got a textbook in front of me. So I'm doing this off the top of my head, so I'm probably off the mark.
That's fine. Sorry about asking the question so vague. So if you look at the arterial venous side of the CO2 pressure differences, the content is changed to about 4.7 mils versus the oxygen concentration changed only about 1.7 mils per 100 mils. So there's a large increase in content, which is I guess an important part to talk about. And then that's sort of a very large increase in PO2, versus a small increase in CO2. Either way, so just if you're hopefully lucky enough to get this question again, because chances are it will come up again in some future exam. Linear versus sigmoidal, large increase in content of CO2 versus oxygen, and then a large increase in PO2. So in summary, Bohr is all about oxygen, Haldane is all about CO2. So this is a pretty broad question, a lot of areas to cover in this. Discusses the difference between the pulmonary and systemic circulations. So I thought the best way to answer broad questions is with very specific categories. So here are the categories that I think a lot of us would normally have for this answer. Maggie, you're next.
In terms of the differences, for anatomical, I more had about the pump, so that the heart chamber pumping into them is different. So systemic has the left ventricle, which is larger and thicker. The pulmonary system has the right ventricle, which is smaller and thinner. In terms of the vessels, the pulmonary system has a thinner endothelium in the capillary, and the systemic has a thicker endothelium, so a smaller diffusion distance in the pulmonary system. There's a system. That's pretty much all I had for anatomical. I'm not sure if there are other kind of more.
Just put these things, and again, providing, I'm going to recognize, I think we all know that everyone's going to have slightly different things for such a broad topic. And I think the main aim of this is, rather than getting absolutely every point, just getting a really good broad range of points without missing any categories. So I can imagine then that, putting 10 points for an anatomical and minimal for the other stuff will be far worse than putting, 3 points for each category, so that's the way I'm thinking about this question, but keep going.
So blood volumes, and most of the blood volume exists in the systemic circulation. So I had 76% or 3.5 litres of blood volume in the systemic, as opposed to 16% or 800 mils in the pulmonary system.
I've got different volumes, but if you got a good reference for that, all good.
And then the pulmonary system is a low pressure system, so a map of 15. So pulmonary artery systolic pressure of 25, diastolic pressure of 8, and then systemic 120 on 80 with a map of around 90.
Yep.
And that it's a low pulmonary is a low resistance system. Systemic is a high resistance system. I didn't have the numbers. I don't know those numbers. And then in terms of response to low oxygen, I actually didn't get to that part. But the pulmonary system has its hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction, so the blood vessels constrict when there's low oxygen content.
Yeah, that's good. So response to low PO2 specifically, but yeah, hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction due to low PO2. Perfect. I've got this on the other side. So look, these are just the values that I've got from the various texts I've got these answers from, and again, just put as many numbers as I can on that, which I feel like these numbers were important to me because I felt like they were numbers that I'll use in other circumstances anyway. And the only other thing I maybe added was blood flow due to hydrostatic pressure, whereas often in the systemic circulation, there's mechanisms to overcome hydrostatic pressure differences according to demand. That's the one diagram I found that I felt was reasonably good at just showing a lot of the factors on it, if you have time to draw it. I want everyone to just describe what this diagram is showing, and then I'll ask Michelle about it.
So the top image is where you've got, say, high lung volumes.
Yes.
Say total lung capacity, and you've got basically compression of the alveolar capillaries, so underneath the big arrow, which increases your resistance. And then at the bottom image, you've got, say, low lung volume, say residual volume. You've got compression of the extra alveolar vessels instead. And so that also increases pulmonary vascular resistance. So both of them, you get, with the graph, you get the U-shaped graph where resistance is highest at lowest lung volume and highest lung volume.
And just to be specific there, Michelle, so in the top one, you're right. Increased lung volumes can compress alveolar vessels. In the bottom diagram, lower lung volumes, like the lung volume has no, it doesn't compress the extra-alveolar vessels. It just doesn't compress the intra-alveolar vessels. But what does happen to the extra-alveolar vessels at high lung volumes?
The extra-alveolar vessels get stretched.
Yeah, and the term that uses traction on the extra-alveolar vessels, which open them up, increasing their caliber, decreasing their resistance. And you refer to this graph, which is correct. Actually, let's do this as an SAQ now. So discuss pulmonary vascular resistance and the control of pulmonary vascular tone.
So I think for me, my outline is, I think I just have two I don't know whether it's a good answer. I have two equations. So I think the first one is modified. So resistance equals pressure over flow. So, and then the second equation is the Hagen-Poiseuille equation of resistance equals H times viscosity times length over pi radius to the power 4.
Okay.
I think for the first equation, I talk about the resistance, the pulmonary vascular resistance is dependent, it's inversely correlated with pulmonary blood flow. So anything that increases pulmonary blood flow will decrease vascular resistance via recruitment and distension.
So first of all, I like the fact that you had some equations at the start. And there's something important about this that I think it's worth mentioning in the introduction. Is this pulmonary vascular system typical? Like you've quoted kind of the modified Ohm's law, V equals IR. Is it really that? Is it as straightforward as it?
So the resistance kind of, I guess, so I think it is very similar to electrical circuit, that when you have resistors organized in parallel, you have decreased total resistance with increased number of capillary beds. So 1 on R total equals 1 on R1 plus 1 on R2, so on and so forth. So the more the more vascular beds that are opened, the less the total pulmonary resistance, vascular resistance will be.
And have you heard this term impedance?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, tell me about that.
So I think impedance, actually, I might not know the exact relationship between impedance and, is impedance the same as 1 on R?
Impedance, so look, and again, I'm not a physics major or anything, so it means that my understanding of this is going to be far less than anyone in the proper physics realm. But because this is a dynamic system and it's not constant like something in a pipe or like electrical measurement, impedance to me then shows like the impedance to flow that reflects true dynamic changes. And so that's why I just mentioned that term, that maybe that's a better way to better way to describe the resistance in this dynamic system. But the other stuff you said was true.
Yeah.
And in that introduction, pulmonary circulation is a low pressure system, and maybe give some normal values and stuff, which I'm sure you have. But keep going. So let's say you get past the introduction and now you talk about factors. How do you organize that?
Yeah, so I talked about, so the first thing, so I think over there I talked about blood flow. because I think increased pulmonary arterial pressure or venous pressure both decrease pulmonary vascular resistance by increasing flow to the circulation.
The increased cardiac output decreases PVR?
Yeah.
Yep, good. And what does that do to again?
Distension and recruitment.
Perfect. Good. Keep
And
going.
then I talk about then with the Hagen-Poiseuille equation, I think it's sort of difficult to organize the information because there are lots of different ways you can do it. But I think logically, I just look at the most, the factor that has the most impact is the radius or the vascular diameter or radius.
Good.
And that is dependent on like dynamic factors such as lung volume that has the influence on the vascular resistance. So both at high and low lung volumes, the pulmonary vascular resistance is high, and at the FRC, it is the lowest. And I think previously we talked about that's because of the extra-alveolar vessels and intra-alveolar vessels.
Sounds good.
Yeah, there's a graph that goes like a U shape, and U being the FRC, and then on the x-axis is the lung volume, y-axis is the that one.
Actually,
oh no, not that one, the other one, the lung volume one.
Yeah, I'll come to it. Actually, that's this one here.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Yep. So I'll draw this graph. What does this graph show?
That shows that with increasing venous arterial pressures, you have, hang on, let me see. You have a drop in the pulmonary vascular resistance with the PAP having a more dramatic effect.
Yeah, that sounds good. And what's that an example of again? You mentioned this just before. This is kind of a graph of what you've said about cardiac output.
Oh yeah, so if you have higher cardiac output, so if you have increased, for example, you increase your preload, you can have increased pulmonary arterial pressure, and then you have decreased resistance.
Yeah, exactly. Recruitment and distension.
Yeah.
And so yeah, you've talked about a lot of the factors that I've talked about. Just the way I've organized it is, I guess passive control in a sense. So cardiac output then causes recruitment and distension, and then decreases the pulmonary vascular resistance. And I insert this graph, FRC due to the intra and extra alveolar vessels, and I draw this graph. Blood factors I talk about having, with Hagen-Poiseuille equation, I think that you mentioned as well. And then gravity effects, which are essentially western of the lung. Yeah. And then there's the active control stuff. So any active control of your radius, and I think of CO2, O2, sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, humoral, and potentially drugs as well. And so that's what that's my format to try and cover as much as I can. But yeah, everyone will have a slightly different format to allow them to remember it, and this just seems to work for me. But I like that the fact that you put the graphs there and knew how to talk about those. I think that's all very good. Annie, what is critical opening pressure? It's to do with recruitment and distension.
Yeah, I think it's. I'm guessing. Sorry, I don't think I know this before, but I'm guessing it's the pressure required to have blood flow through vasculature.
Kind of. So let's say you've got an unrecruited capillary, the pressure at which the flow occurs, and several centimeters above the downstream pressure, which would make sense. The high pressure to open something, the downstream pressure is high. And then what is the difference between recruitment and distension? What do you reckon?
Recruitment is actually previously, so you have enough critical opening pressure to open collapsed capillaries, while distension is just making the diameter bigger of the vessel.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, that's a diagrammatic representation of that. Distribution of blood flow. Let's go into this. So this is essentially going to be talking about west zones of the lung.
So going through the West zones from independent to dependent zone. So the most least gravity dependent would be zone 1, where your alveolar pressure is greater than your arterial pressure and therefore greater than your venous pressure and therefore no blood flow, which hopefully shouldn't happen in health, but in shocked or high airway pressure situations may occur.
Yep.
Zone 2 is where the arterial pressure is greater than the alveolar pressure, which is greater than the venous pressure and works as though sort of the Starling resistor mechanism, where you get flow dependent on the change between the alveolar and the venous pressure.
I like that you mentioned Starling resistor there. Like, you know, essentially, I feel like that's the key mnemonic for me, and the key facet of that is that you've got a Starling resistor, and that's something that we'll use throughout the first part. So I'm glad that you put that in for anyone who didn't realize that. Keep going.
Zone 3, therefore going more inferiorly, is where the arterial pressure is greater than the venous pressure, which is greater than the alveolar pressure, which is more consistent with what we'd see something maybe in systemic circulation.
Yes.
And then zone 4 is kind of an interesting one because it's hard to define, but the loss of the radial tension in the low volume state closes those extra alveolar pressures, vessels, and therefore I kind of define it as the pressure of the tissue or the parenchyma is greater than the arterial, which is greater than venous, which is greater than alveolar.
At that last one, I've got here that the pressure arterial, it's a difference between arterial and interstitial pressure that defines blood flow.
Okay.
And it will decrease as the interstitial pressure increases. But everything else you said was fine. So I wouldn't say there's no pressure there. So it isn't that the interstitial is greater than P arterial necessarily. It could become like that. But essentially I've got here, yeah, this, as you can see, that there is still blood flow there.
Okay.
How does it, so distributes due to gravity, and you've described the West zones. What happens when the patient's supine?
In supine lungs, the anterior component of the chest wall will become the zone 1, or the top part of the diagram, and the posterior component will become the sort of zone 3, 4 area, so the gravity dependent component of lung.
So the West zones will change simply based on gravity. How about if the patient is, I guess, upside down or in the prone position would be, oh, sorry, upside down, like they're literally doing a handstand?
Yeah, just flip my page upside down as well. And so the apex of the lung would now be sort of the zone 3, 4 section, with the bases of the lung being the gravity dependent zone. Oh, sorry, is that right? Confused myself.
I think you're right. As in, you said that you just flip it. You simply have the base as the apex, and everything else, you know.
Yeah, just flip it upside down.
Exactly. How about with exercise? What occurs?
With exercise, there's increased pulmonary artery pressure, so you get distension, recruitment, and therefore it actually causes less of this disparity and better VQ, or it amends a lot of the VQ mismatch that occurs physiologically due to the distribution of blood flow.
Yeah, so there's more even blood flow, decreasing the VQ inequalities. And I've just got there, what is the pressure difference between the apex and base of a vertical lung? How have I come up with those numbers there?
So these ones, I'm trying to remember, I was actually thinking maybe intrapleural pressure. That's what I wrote down for mine. So I've mixed that up, but is this
blood flow? Sorry, not
blood flow. Okay.
West zones essentially is blood flow distribution. We're not really talking about ventilation per se. So, yeah, why is the pressure difference? Those numbers that I've got there.
Pressure difference just due to gravity in terms of how they measure it.
Yep.
I don't actually know whether they could chuck in a pulmonary artery catheter higher and lower and then decide the pressure difference, whether that's the way.
Yeah, and I mean, why do I have there 30 centimeters water of pressure difference from the apex to the base?
Just because that's generally the height of the lung.
Yeah, exactly. It's as simple as that. The height of the lung is approximately 30 centimeters, and millimeters mercury is about 3/4 of that. So 23 millimeters mercury. Yeah, good. Any questions about that before we move on?
There's two fine things. Would you make a comment about that it would minimize the hydrostatic pressure difference, so you would also have a more even? Is that right, that you'd have a more even spread because the difference between the top and the bottom is not as big?
You're just cutting out there. Which context were you saying there's minimization? I didn't hear that.
Fine. Like you still have a gradient, but the gradient isn't over as big a.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. Yeah, I mean, I can't see a reason why it wouldn't. If there's less, I can imagine that all these numbers, depend on, obviously they depend on a few things, and I haven't seen any experimental data to show what the difference is. But yeah, you'd either have less distribution, you'd have less of the top and the bottom, 1 and 4. Yeah, I can imagine that there'd be far more uniform distribution because there's far less of a pressure gradient to spread those differences out. But I haven't seen any experimental data on it. If I got that question, I'd just describe it in the terms of gravity and make reasonable statements like you have. Okay, guys, outline the non-ventilatory functions of the lung.
So I had 6 main ones. So filtration was my first. Then defense against inhaled particles. So the mucociliary escalator with its mucus layer and its water layer. And I didn't really go into it, but the action of the cilia.
Yes.
Then the second defense role is against different pathogens, which the mucociliary escalator comes into, but then chemical roles of the surfactant, lysosomes, and protease enzymes, and then its role in immune defenses, so immunoglobulins in the airway lining and epithelial cells and macrophages.
Yep.
And then 4 was heat and moisture exchange. 5 was processing of endogenous compounds, so the role of ACE in the endothelial cells. And then the last I had was pharmacokinetics, so things like inhaled drug delivery and elimination of, I guess, things like anaesthetic agents and stuff.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm just going to ask you a few spot questions. How much volume, in terms of reservoir, as a blood reservoir, how much volume is in the lungs?
Oh, I would be purely guessing, but maybe half a litre.
Yeah, 450 mils I've got here, so that's very good. Let's talk about what are some of the agents that are metabolized? Just to name a few.
Agents that are metabolized.
Yeah, chemicals are metabolized.
Like drugs, like fentanyl or
endogenous substances.
Oh, okay. What is
ACE will be involved in.
Arachidonic acid is.
I don't have arachidonic acid in my, but if you've got a reference for that, that's great.
No, I don't. Sorry, I have reference to that. I can't remember. I'm not sure. Sorry.
Angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2.
Oh, sorry. That's what you mean. Yeah.
And then bradykinin inactivated up to 80%. Serotonin, also prostaglandins and noradrenaline.
Okay.
Good. Now, just an extra. So, in terms of drugs, which drugs are eliminated in some fashion by the lung?
So fentanyl is, I think, nitrofurantoin might be.
I've not heard about nitrofurantoin. Tell me about fentanyl being eliminated by the lungs.
Oh, I can't remember the exact pathway. I'm sorry.
That's right. Yeah, I've got here 75% first pass through the lungs.
Okay.
Propranolol and chlorpromazine, but obviously volatiles would be the obvious one.
Yes. Yeah.
Look, the extra non-ventilatory function of the lungs I've got here is phonation. It makes sense. You need that to speak. Buoyancy, if you're a diver, or even just if you're trying to float in any mass of water, and acid-base function. So just a couple of extra things that I don't think were in the Kerry Bandis kind of list. And does anyone, just for everyone's sake, does anyone have a good mnemonic that they find useful for remembering, just getting this memory out of the way?
No, but that'd be great if someone does.
Yeah, can either post it on the chat or just tell us now.
I have one, but it's really inappropriate.
Go for it. Love inappropriate.
It's firm tits.
Firm tits. Yep, just go through what that stands for.
So filtration, immune, reservoir, so reservoir of blood and gas or air, oxygen, sorry, metabolic, and then thermoregulation, inhalational agents, just as an admin route, taking up drugs, so fentanyl, lignocaine, propofol, and then surfactant synthesis.
Okay, so just to get that clearly, filtration, immune, reservoir, metabolism. What were the what's the last part of it?
Last one, so thermoregulation. Sorry, I rushed through it.
Right.
Inhalational agents, so admin route for them. Yeah. Taking up drugs, and then surfactant synthesis.
Right. Excellent. Use whatever you guys have to remember the stuff. I used to use mnemonics, for varying things, just when I need to just learn something quickly, and some of them were just the most stupid things, but they still help me. Like I wouldn't use it for everything. Like understanding something is really important as well, but just using some kind of mnemonic is just so vital. Just take a screenshot or photo of this question. So, what lower limit of SpO2 would you accept in an ASA1 young male under general anesthesia? Explain your reasons for choosing this value.
In a healthy ASA1 patient, I start off by defining SpO2, which is the plethysmographic oxygen saturation, or the percentage of oxygen-bound hemoglobin at systole, or the peak oxygen hemoglobin bound.
Sounds good.
A normal SpO2 for this patient would be above 96%.
Yes.
And I would aim for oxygen saturation above 96%, because that is their physiological baseline. The reasons for this, first of all, I discussed why I'd be targeting such a high concentration. And in that, I drew the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve to show that the flat part of the curve occurs above a saturation of about 91%, and a pO2 of 60 millimeters of mercury. And that's the reason I would target kind of 96 above 91 is to give some kind of buffer for oxygenation in a setting where in an exercise patient, oxygen or ventilation and oxygen delivery is compromised. And that's in the setting of there's a decreased functional residual capacity, often increased oxygen consumption. There's often decreased delivery due to decreased cake output, and there can be a right shift of the curve. And so by targeting a value above a high part on the flat part of the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, you give yourself a buffer if those things were to change. And then the second part I discussed briefly about why you wouldn't target 100%. And that's talking about things like diffusional atelectasis and production of reactive oxygen species.
Okay. So no, that's pretty good. So you went through a systematic way of doing things. So the first thing I want to say is that this question obviously feels really clinical compared to a lot of the other questions you might get on the first part. And so, it almost borders on a second part type question. And so you have to, very much like the second part, you have to state a lower limit, which you've done, which is great. And then you have to, kind of give your reasons for it. But the reason, because it's a first part answer, it's a little bit disingenuous in the sense that they're asking you for a very clinical second part style. They're asking a very clinical second part style question, but then you've got to completely frame it around the fact that it's a first part question. And not every little chunk of knowledge that the examiners seem to require, may really feel like it's necessary for the answer. So this is what I've put together as my answer. And I'll just kind of go through it, and it combines some of the stuff you mentioned, but also just combines a few things because you're playing the game. So I'm going to define normal ranges of boring stuff. SpO2 ASA male, they may not want this, but it's a part of the structure that will get me marks with most examiners most of the time. It doesn't take much time, and if I didn't put it in and some examiners say, oh look, you should define it, then I've covered myself. I've talked about the importance of SpO2, so that's where you can this chunk of knowledge here, the importance of SpO2 is all about drawing that graph, talking about the implications of that graph and delivery to important organs. So, you know, the graph helps you talk about that in as much, you know, detail as you've got time for. I've then talked about mechanisms of increasing oxygen in times of low SpO2, and that's not necessarily something that you would even think about doing in this question, but it's the first part, relevance of this for this question, that I'm just trying to draw into you know, other chunks of knowledge that I can insert, you know, given a question about SpO2 and hypoxemia. What lower limit would I accept? This is where it gets very second party, and you know, it's not a specific number, it's an approach. I would be concerned at any decrease not accounted for by VQ mismatch shunt anaesthetic causes. I'd be concerned if there was evidence of hypoxia or impaired oxygen delivery. I would consider the risk benefit of treating the low SpO2 with the risk of benefit of not treating this. So maybe you can talk about the, you know, why you wouldn't aim at 100% oxygenation, you know, 100% oxygen FI necessarily. I'd probably state this lower limit at the very start and state a concern about a length of time at this lower limit, you know, as just an extra little thing to talk about. But let's, you know, take a screen capture or, you know, photo of my kind of answer or my approach to that answer. To me, the key points of this is I'm giving some definitions, formatting a structure. I'm giving an answer to the question that's reasonable, but then I'm trying to chunk other bits of knowledge that I can, you know, that's very first part relevant. That doesn't exactly answer the question, but it's like playing a percentage game here, where I know that this may be able to be marked, and it's just adding stuff that I have time to add to, you know, to achieve as high a mark as possible, not knowing that I cannot read the minds of the examiners at any given time. Does someone want to have a go at this one? Describe the physiological basis of methods used to prevent hypoxemia prior to intubation in rapid sequence induction.
So the way that I structured this one, do you want me to go through the broad titles and then go into them, or?
Yeah, that's definitely good. That's how I would imagine I'd write down the answers in the exam.
Yeah, no worries. So I gave a definition for hypoxemia first of all, then I spoke about increasing the oxygen reservoir, and I spoke about apneic oxygenation, and then at the end I spoke about the risks of the above kind of methods, but it's kind of, I didn't think it was non-essential, that's why I kind of left it to the end. So at the beginning, hypoxemia is defined as partial pressure of oxygen less than 16 millimeters of mercury. And then I said that there is a potential for hypoxemia with an RSI because there is a period of apnea between loss of consciousness and intubation, while there is ongoing oxygen consumption by the patient. And then section 2, I spoke about the increase in the oxygen reservoir. So I spoke about positioning. So upright position increases your FRC, which increases your O2 reserve. Pre-oxygenation, so I wrote 100% oxygen for 3 to 5 minutes will increase the oxygen in the lungs and increase that reserve volume once again. Hyperventilation, this decreases your partial pressure of carbon dioxide and increases your partial pressure of oxygen. And the last one, under increased O2 reservoir, I wrote about using a small amount of CPAP of around 5 centimeters of water to splints and opens the alveoli and limits the decrease in FRC on induction. I then went into speaking about apneic oxygenation, so the principle of continuing high flow O2 while the patient's apneic with a good seal, and also potentially using other adjuncts, so using nasal cannulae when you're intubating or using Thrive when you're intubating. And then I spoke I actually didn't get down too many for this, but I just briefly spoke about risks of using 100% oxygen, such as absorption atelectasis, lung injury, risks in neonates, such as retinopathy of the newborn, barotrauma, discomfort for the patient, and that's all I got down.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, so I've just gone through each of these things that I could put, you know, anything I've ever heard about that I would use in in a rapid sequence induction to prevent hypoxemia, and just talked facts about it. And again, I've chucked in things that seem relevant, but not necessarily, I feel like I don't need them to answer this question, but something like the alveolar gas equation, I can invoke and put it out there, and it's not going to waste too much time, and it's potentially something that could get marks. As you can see, I've put in red here, fast muscle relaxant sucks and the side effects, and cricoid as a thing as well. But if you guys seen the examiner's report, there's probably something that's pretty obvious, something that you may have already gone through. If you look at the 2004 to the 2013 examiner's reports, there's this point that says most low-scoring answers included a huge amount of irrelevant information, often extending for several pages. Examples which attracted no marks include, and they talk about cricoid pressure and the side effects of sucks. So that's not something that was described. No extra marks included, and just 9 years later or whatever, you've got extra marks were awarded for adverse effects, physiological effects of induction agents used in rapid sequence induction, and the adverse effects of succinylcholine. And this is incredible. Like it's exactly the same question, and nothing much has changed really. But suddenly they've decided, this examiner's decided that they're going to allow that, or they think that that's reasonable. My point at the end of this is that you just can't imagine examiners have a very difficult task, obviously, with examining and doing this. And I do think that they make these very mighty statements about what was clearly and obviously and disappointing, whatever rhetoric they use. But that's not the game we have to play. The game we have to play is trying to just get the marks down as best as you can, knowing that any one examiner might completely want something different, and that's their problem, and that's not my problem. I thought it would be useful to go through those, just to highlight those facets about, just especially for these very clinically relevant questions. It's still a game. Put down as much as you can that's even remotely related, because you cannot read the mind of the examiner. But first and foremost, try to answer the question as best as you can.
Can I just ask a really quick question?
Yeah, please.
Just something I just got a bit tied up in while I was actually physically writing out. But basically, when I was trying to just demonstrate why pre-oxygenation, increasing oxygen reservoir, gives you a longer safe apnea time. So I wrote the alveolar gas equation, and that gives you a PaO2 at the level of the alveolar.
Yes.
Then I was trying to figure out how many mils are there, because to basically say, if you're using 250 mils a minute, this will give you, this much extra. How do you make the jump from PaO2 to mils of oxygen in the lung?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. So I'd do less of that, but the traditional way that I have, calculated how much oxygen volume I have in the lungs is by calculating what the FRC is, or what the volume in the lung is, and the end tidal oxygen through my gas monitor, and that gives me the 80% oxygenation at the end of my pre-oxygenation period. I'd multiply that by my FRC, roughly 2 liters, to give me an amount. That's
a much easier way of doing it. So if you've got 100% pre-oxygenation, just to make it easy, you could just say you've got 3 liters of oxygen.
Yes. Yeah. If you've got 3 liters of FRC, 3 liters of oxygen, absolutely.
Okay.
And this is interesting, right? So this mandated a discussion on the role of FRC as an oxygen store, and pre-oxygenation as a means of augmenting that store. Better Answers demonstrated this using the alveolar gas equation. So, I don't know exactly why you need the alveolar gas equation to demonstrate that, but you can imagine that if you get an alveolar value of a certain amount of PO2, you can, I think what they're asking is just to extrapolate that to say that there's a large proportion of the, using Dalton's law, if you have a, your partial pressure of oxygen is as maximally high as it could be, you could use that as a surrogate percentage instead of using your end tidal oxygen. That's the only way I really think you could use that, but it's not necessary to use that.
Yeah, awesome. That's what confused me as well, but yeah, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's pretty much all have time to go through, and that's really the end of our lecture.